All right, so we're diving into some pretty intense geopolitical stuff today
Yeah.
with F. William Engdahl's Full Spectrum Dominance.
Mm-hmm.
This book, it came out in 2009,
Yeah.
and it really gets into like all these hidden currents of global power,
Yeah.
And you asked us to unpack it specifically. You wanted to know how events like the 2008 war in Georgia fit into this like bigger picture.
Yeah, and Engdahl, he lays out this really fascinating argument, but it's definitely controversial.
Okay.
He starts by challenging this common assumption that after the Cold War things got stable, you know.
Right.
Instead, he says it just changed how power is used on the world stage.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And he uses this a pretty stark example to show what he means, right?
Right.
This idea of shock therapy for Russia's economy in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
What's he talking about there?
So he's talking about how after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia's economy was rapidly privatized.
Okay.
And Engdahl says that groups like the International Monetary Fund, they pushed for this super fast shift to a market economy.
And that caused some problems.
Yeah, some pretty bad consequences.
Like what?
Well, think about it. You
Right.
have all these state-owned industries suddenly up for grabs.
Uh-huh.
It was chaos, and some people took advantage.
So you're saying like people with money and connections, they just swooped in?
Yeah, basically a small group ended up with tons of wealth.
While regular people in Russia struggled?
Exactly.
And Engdahl argues this wasn't just like an economic policy.
Right.
It was a way to like reshape Russia's power structure.
Yeah, and he takes it even further.
Yeah.
He says this shock therapy wasn't just about Russia becoming capitalist.
Uh-huh.
It was meant to weaken Russia and let Western interests gain control of valuable assets for basically nothing.
He even compares some of these industries to crown jewels.
Yeah, he says they were sold for pennies.
It's a strong image.
It is.
You can really see what he's getting at.
And this sets the stage for how he analyzes the 2008 war in Georgia.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting. He compares it to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But how are they connected? They happen decades apart. They're totally different situations.
Well, on the surface, yeah.
Right.
But Engdahl's point is about understanding the strategy behind these events that seem isolated.
Okay.
Remember, in 2007, Putin compared the U.S. missile defense system in Europe to the Soviet Union putting missiles in Cuba.
Yeah, that was a pretty provocative statement.
It got everyone's attention.
It did.
And that's Engdahl's point. Both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the war in Georgia, even though they're different in scale, they were about challenging whoever seemed to be in charge at the time.
So the missiles weren't the point. It was about sending a message.
Exactly. They're strategic power plays.
Trying to change the rules of the game.
Right, to disrupt the power dynamics.
Okay, so how does this all tie into a larger strategy?
Well, to understand Engdahl's perspective, we need to look at something called Mackinder's heartland theory.
Well, let's unpack that. What is this theory?
So basically it argues that whoever controls the Eurasian landmass,
Okay.
what Mackinder called the heartland, controls the world.
Okay. I can see how that would be relevant to Russia.
Right.
But how does it connect to U.S. foreign policy and NATO expansion?
Engdahl says the U.S. has been influenced by Mackinder's ideas.
For a long time.
Yeah, especially during the Cold War.
Okay.
So if we look at NATO expansion,
Uh-huh.
it raises some questions. Is it just defensive, like the West says?
Okay.
Or is it a way to contain Russia?
To stop Russia from becoming too powerful.
Exactly, to keep it from becoming that dominant Eurasian power that Mackinder warned about.
So Engdahl's suggesting the U.S. is actively trying to prevent Russia from achieving this kind of geopolitical dominance. But is this theory, it's over a century old?
Yeah.
Does it still apply today?
That's a good question. Engdahl thinks so,
Okay.
but it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
And it leads to another part of his argument, the shift in U.S. strategy.
From controlling land.
Yeah, to controlling something more important in the modern world.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What is that?
Resources, things like oil and natural gas. Engdahl says this shift really took hold during the George W. Bush administration,
Really?
especially with the Cheney energy strategy.
Okay, so how does this focus on resources connect to everything else we've been talking about?
Well, remember, Dick Cheney said that the Middle East is where the prize ultimately lies.
Uh-huh.
So Engdahl argues that U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq
Okay.
and the whole war on terror
Yeah.
can be seen as a way to secure access to these resources.
So he's saying these military interventions weren't just about fighting terrorism.
Right.
It was about controlling oil and gas.
That's his argument.
Okay,
It's complex and not everyone agrees with it.
I bet.
But it makes you think about the economic and geopolitical reasons behind these conflicts.
It definitely makes me rethink things.
Yeah.
Now, Engdahl also talks about these color revolutions. What are those and how do they fit into all of this?
So he argues that alongside traditional military interventions, the U.S. has developed these more sophisticated ways to change regimes. They rely on soft power.
Okay.
And the color revolutions in places like Georgia and Ukraine are perfect examples.
And he talks about organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, being involved in these events.
He argues that these groups that seem independent,
Okay.
they promote democracy and human rights.
Right.
He says they're actually tools of U.S. foreign policy used to advance its interests.
So they're not as independent as they seem.
Right.
And they're being used to further U.S. goals.
Under the guise of humanitarianism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it brings us to another key part of his argument, the weaponization of human rights.
Okay, I'm really interested in how does he connect human rights to all of this?
So Engdahl argues that the U.S. uses human rights causes strategically to get what it wants.
Interesting.
Especially in regions with lots of resources.
Oh, wait, where?
He talks about Darfur. The U.S. condemned the genocide there.
Right.
But at the same time, they were supporting regimes with bad human rights records.
Like who?
Like Chad. And guess what? Chad's an oil producer.
So he's saying the U.S. uses human rights language when it's convenient, but ignores abuses when it benefits them.
Yeah, it's like a double standard.
It's a thought-provoking argument.
It is.
And all of these threads, like the shift in how power is used, the focus on resources, the soft power, and the selective human rights stuff.
Right.
Engdahl says they all lead to the ultimate goal of U.S. military strategy.
Which is?
Full spectrum dominance.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into that next. What does he mean by full spectrum dominance?
He means total control.
Of everything.
Not just land, sea, and air, but
Right.
space and even cyberspace.
That's a lot.
He points to the expansion of U.S. military bases around the world.
Right.
The development of advanced weapons like Star Wars. And a shift toward being able to launch a nuclear strike first.
As evidence of this ambition.
Right.
And there's that chilling detail he brings up.
Yeah.
The Pentagon plan, called Conplan 8022.
This plan basically lets the U.S. president launch a nuclear strike first.
And that came into effect in 2004.
Yeah. Pretty scary stuff.
It is. And Engdahl doesn't hold back on the potential consequences of this full spectrum dominance.
No, he doesn't.
But before we get into that,
Okay.
we should probably look at this from other angles too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Are there other ways to interpret these events? Other perspectives we should be aware of?
Definitely Engdahl's book presents a specific viewpoint.
And it's controversial.
It is, and it's important to be critical.
Yeah, so the next part will explore some of those alternative perspectives. We'll try to get a more complete picture of this whole thing.
Sounds good. So we were talking about how Engdahl's book, it has a specific point of view.
Right, and we want to make sure we're not just taking his word for it.
Exactly. We need to look at this critically.
So how do we even do that when we're talking about global politics? It's so complicated.
Well, one way is to think about his sources.
Okay.
He uses a lot of history geopolitical theories like Mackinder's and writings from people who agree with him. But are there other sources, other experts who might see things differently?
So we're not just looking at what he says.
Right.
We're looking at where his information comes from.
Exactly, and seeing if there are other ways to interpret that evidence.
Okay, I like that approach.
And we can also think about counterarguments to his claims.
Like what?
Well, he says NATO expansion is about containing Russia.
Yeah.
But what would people who support NATO say?
I guess they'd say it's about promoting democracy and stability in Europe.
Exactly.
Especially since a lot of the countries that joined NATO after the Cold War were part of the Soviet bloc before.
Right, and they might also say that the U.S. military presence around the world,
which Engdahl sees as part of full-spectrum dominance.
Yeah, they might say it's actually needed to prevent attacks and protect global trade.
So it's not as simple as saying one side is right and one is wrong.
Definitely not.
There are probably lots of reasons for any foreign policy decision.
Absolutely. It's complex, and that's where critical thinking comes in.
Right. We need to be able to weigh the evidence,
Yeah.
look at different viewpoints.
And then decide for ourselves what we think.
Okay, so another thing Engdahl talks about is this idea that the U.S. uses human rights to get what it wants. He used the example of Darfur.
Right.
And how the U.S. condemned the genocide there but supported Chad, which has its own human rights problems.
Because Chad has oil.
Exactly.
So it raises these questions like, is the U.S. really committed to human rights everywhere?
Or just when it's convenient for them.
Yeah.
Or is it a selective commitment,
That gets pushed aside when something more important comes up.
like strategic or economic interests?
Tough question.
It is, and I think Engdahl would say it's often the latter.
That the U.S. only really cares about human rights when it helps them.
Yeah, but again, there are other viewpoints.
Okay.
Some people might say that the U.S. does try to promote human rights
But it's really difficult, and sometimes they have to make compromises.
to achieve bigger goals.
Exactly. So it's a balancing act, and what's most important to you influences where you draw the line.
Yeah, I could see that.
And it's good to know about these different perspectives when trying to understand these global events.
For sure. Now, let's go back to this full spectrum dominance idea.
Okay.
What are some counterarguments to that?
Well, one could be that the U.S. is just acting in its own self-interest.
Like any other country would,
Exactly. So it's not necessarily about building an empire.
but about protecting themselves.
Right, and keeping themselves prosperous.
Okay, that makes sense.
What else? Another point is that the world is different now than during the Cold War.
How so?
There are more powerful countries now, like China and India.
So the U.S. isn't the only superpower anymore?
Exactly. So even if they are trying for full spectrum dominance,
It's going to be a lot harder.
right, they have more competition now.
That's a good point.
And also the idea of full spectrum dominance itself is debated. Yeah, some military analysts say it's not realistic.
I don't think it's possible.
Right, and that the U.S. military should focus on things they can actually achieve.
So even within the military, there's disagreement about this strategy.
Exactly. Now let's look closer at Engdahl's claim that resources like oil drive U.S. foreign policy.
He's basically saying that a lot of what the U.S. does in the Middle East is about oil and gas, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people who are critical of U.S. foreign policy agree with that.
Okay.
But another argument is that the U.S. wants stability in the Middle East.
Because it's important for the global energy supply,
Right, so they might say they're not just trying to get oil for themselves.
but trying to make sure everyone gets the oil they need.
Exactly, and they might also point out that the U.S. works with countries like Saudi Arabia.
Which doesn't have the best human rights record.
Right, to achieve this goal of stability.
So again, it's about balancing values and interests.
Yeah, and your perspective influences how you balance those.
Okay, so this leads to another question.
What's
What does U.S. foreign policy mean for the rest of the world?
Good question. Engdahl thinks this pursuit of full-spectrum dominance could lead to a new Cold War.
This time with China.
Exactly, and it's a real possibility.
Yeah, the U.S. and China are already competing a lot,
They are, and it could easily get worse.
especially with the potential for conflict over resources and trade and technology.
Right, and this is where Engdahl's focus on history is relevant.
Okay.
He says the U.S. tends to see the world as a zero-sum game.
Meaning if one country wins, another one has to lose.
Exactly.
And he thinks this mindset is dangerous.
Yeah, he thinks it could make the world more unstable and lead to more conflict.
That's a scary thought.
It is, and it's a concern shared by a lot of people who study international relations.
So as we move into the last part of this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some key things we should keep in mind
Well, I think it's important to remember that there's rarely one right answer.
to these complex geopolitical questions?
Right, we need to be open to different views, look at the evidence, and have discussions about these things.
Wow, it feels like we've gone really deep here.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Engdahl really lays out this complex system of forces.
He does, and as we've said, there are lots of ways to interpret all this.
Right.
But even if you don't agree with him on everything, I think his book is valuable.
How so?
It makes us think critically about the stories we're told.
Yeah, I like that about these deep dives.
Me too.
It's not just about learning new information.
Right.
It's about questioning things and challenging what everyone thinks they know.
Exactly. It makes us more informed and engaged.
Okay, so Engdahl's book isn't just about criticizing the U.S.
No.
He's calling for action.
He is.
But what does that even look like?
Hmm.
What can we actually do as individuals about these huge global forces?
It's a good question. I think the first step is awareness.
Like what we've been doing in this deep dive.
Yeah, understanding the power dynamics, the motivations, the potential consequences.
So education is step one.
Right. But knowing things without doing anything is just watching from the sidelines.
So what does action look like?
Lots of things. It could mean supporting groups that promote peace or human rights or sustainability.
Okay.
It could be getting involved in local politics, advocating for policies you believe in, talking to people who have different opinions than you.
So it's not just about thinking differently.
Right.
It's about doing things differently too.
Exactly. And even small actions can make a difference.
I like that.
Engdahl says that this path, we're on this full spectrum dominance and the chance of conflict, it's not guaranteed.
Okay.
It's a choice.
So we have a say in what happens.
We do. We can choose a different future.
But that means we have to be involved.
Yeah, informed, engaged, active.
Now, Engdahl really emphasizes history in his book.
He does.
He says we can't understand the present without understanding the past.
And that history doesn't just repeat itself.
It rhymes.
Yeah, there are patterns we can learn from.
So studying history can help us see how power has been used before.
And what mistakes have been made.
So we don't repeat them.
Exactly. And Engdahl's book shows how looking at history can explain what's happening today.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some key things you think our listeners should remember?
Well, first, question everything.
Don't just believe everything you hear.
Right. Don't just accept official stories or what the media says.
Okay.
Look deeper. Explore different perspectives. Think for yourself.
Be a critical thinker.
Exactly. And second, remember that events that seem isolated are usually part of bigger patterns.
Like Engdahl shows in his book.
Yeah, he connects the dots between things that seem unrelated.
And helps us see the bigger picture.
Right, the forces that are shaping the world.
And lastly,
We're not just watching history unfold.
we're a part of it.
We are, and our choices matter.
We can make a difference.
We can create a better future, one that's fairer and more sustainable.
A future where everyone thrives.
That's the goal.
Well said. Engdahl's Full Spectrum Dominance is a tough book.
It is.
But it really makes you think.
It does, and it's relevant to what's happening today.
It definitely makes you see the world differently.
It has for me.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We hope you've learned something new about geopolitics and that you feel empowered to engage with these issues.
Yeah, it's important to be informed and active.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep trying to make a positive impact.
Couldn't have said it better myself.